A homeless man approached Johnny Depp on the street. With tired eyes and a trembling voice, he made a simple request. "Can you give me $1?" But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Instead of ignoring him, as most would do, Johnny Depp looked into the homeless man's eyes, and what he did next changed everything. It wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a response that left everyone around in shock. What happened there was more than just a simple act of help. It was a moment that transformed both of their lives forever. If you're curious to find out how this encounter ended, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button now. Don't miss the chance to follow this unique and heartwarming story to the very end. Share it with your friends and come discover the power of a simple act of humanity. On the sidewalk of a busy street in Los Angeles, the sound of hurried footsteps mixed with the constant noise of cars and distant conversations. It was just another ordinary day for most people. But for the homeless man sitting in a shadowy corner of the sidewalk, it was yet another day of invisibility. His clothes were torn, his face covered by a thick, unkempt beard, and his tired eyes carried the weight of a life that seemed to have forgotten him. He held a cardboard sign with smudged letters, "Hungry. Any help is welcome." People passed by him as if he were part of the scenery. Some averted their eyes, while others pretended not to see him. But on that day, something different happened. A tall man, wearing a black fedora hat and dark sunglasses, walked calmly down the sidewalk. He had a relaxed posture, but there was something about his presence that drew attention, even without trying. The homeless man looked up, intrigued. Something about this man seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. With a hoarse and hesitant voice, he took a chance. "Hey, can you spare me $1?" The man stopped. The movement around them seemed to slow down. He lowered his sunglasses, revealing eyes that seemed to scrutinize every detail of that moment. He smiled faintly, but didn't speak right away. The tension was palpable. A few people nearby noticed the interaction and began to watch discreetly. The homeless man, unsure of what to expect, kept his gaze on him, a mix of hope and mistrust in his expression. Finally, the man spoke. "What would you do with $1?" The homeless man blinked, confused. He hadn't expected that question. He thought for a moment before replying. I'd buy something to eat. Maybe a coffee." The man tilted his head, as if weighing the answer. Then he did something entirely unexpected. He crouched down to the homeless man's level, looking directly into his eyes. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked, his tone calm but firm. The homeless man slowly shook his head. He had no idea he was speaking with Johnny Depp, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Johnny smiled again, this time with a mysterious sparkle in his eyes. "Maybe today you'll find out." And so began an interaction that would completely change that man's life. Johnny Depp sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, directly across from the homeless man. His unexpected gesture caused a ripple of whispers among the onlookers, who slowed their pace, curious about what was unfolding. The homeless man, still clutching his cardboard sign, looked bewildered. No one had ever stopped to talk to him like this, much less a stranger who exuded an air of mystery and authority. Johnny broke the silence. "What's your name?" Michael." The man stammered, unsure why a stranger, let alone someone so well-dressed, cared to know. "All right, Michael." Johnny leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Tell me something. How did you end up here?" Michael's eyes darted away. He wasn't sure if he wanted to share his story with this man or anyone else, but there was something about Johnny's presence that felt safe. After a long pause, he began to speak. "I lost my job a few years ago. Worked in construction. Then, my wife left me. Said she couldn't handle it anymore. After that, things just spiraled." Johnny listened intently, nodding occasionally. The sincerity in his eyes made it clear he wasn't just listening out of politeness. He genuinely cared. "So now," Michael continued, "I'm just trying to get by. $1 here, a meal there." Johnny took off his hat and placed it on the ground beside him. "Do you believe things can change, Michael?" Michael laughed bitterly. "For people like you, sure. For people like me? Not so much." Johnny's expression shifted. His eyes darkened, but not with anger, with determination. "That's where you're wrong, Michael." The crowd around them grew larger. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the strange yet captivating scene. Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $1 bill. He held it up between his fingers. "This is what you asked for, right?" Michael nodded hesitantly. "But," Johnny said, his voice rising slightly, "what if I told you that this dollar could be worth far more than you think?" Michael frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Johnny leaned closer, his tone now almost a whisper. "What if I told you that this dollar is the start of something bigger? That it's not just money, it's a chance." Michael's heart raced. He didn't know why, but he felt like something extraordinary was about to happen. Michael's confusion turned to skepticism. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Johnny. "Look, man, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but a dollar is just a dollar." Johnny smirked, unbothered by Michael's doubt. He flipped the bill between his fingers, then held it out again. "You're right, Michael. A dollar is just a dollar. But what you do with it, that's what makes the difference." Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the bill. "So what are you saying? That I'm supposed to magically turn this into a fortune or something?" Johnny's gaze didn't waver. "I'm saying you've got a choice. You can take this dollar and see it as nothing more than a quick fix for today's hunger. Or you can see it as the start of something bigger." Michael scoffed, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Easy for you to say. You've got everything. What do you know about starting over?" The crowd murmured at Michael's boldness. Some people even chuckled, amused by his defiance. But Johnny didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone so serious it silenced the onlookers. "You think I've never been at the bottom?" Michael blinked, caught off guard. Johnny continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "You think I don't know what it's like to be judged? To have people look at you and think they know your whole story just by glancing at you?" Michael was silent, his earlier bravado fading. Johnny gestured to the crowd around them. "Look at them. They see me, and they think they know who I am. A rich guy, a movie star, someone who's never had a bad day in his life. But they don't know the battles I've fought, the mistakes I've made." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And they don't know yours either, Michael." The homeless man swallowed hard, his throat tightening. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him not with pity, but with understanding. Johnny placed the dollar on the ground between them. "I'm not here to tell you what to do, Michael. I'm here to remind you that you still have choices." Michael stared at the dollar, his mind racing. It was such a small thing, yet it felt like the weight of the world rested on it. Johnny stood up, brushing the dust off his pants. "The question is, Michael, what will you do with it?" The tension in the air was electric. The crowd watched, holding their breath, as Michael reached for the dollar. Michael's fingers brushed the edge of the dollar bill. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade. The noise of the city, the murmurs of the crowd, even the weight of his own doubts. It was as if time itself had stopped, and he was faced with a single, life-altering choice. He grabbed the dollar, feeling its crisp texture in his hand. Johnny stood silently, watching him with an intensity that was almost unnerving. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, grew still. For a moment, Michael thought he'd made his decision. But as he stood up, his mind raced, filled with questions. What was Johnny really offering him? A dollar? A chance? Or something deeper? Something he wasn't yet ready to face? Johnny took a step back, as if sensing Michael's hesitation. He raised his hand, palm open, and slowly, deliberately, pulled off his sunglasses. His eyes, those familiar eyes that had captivated millions on the big screen, locked with Michael's. But it wasn't the eyes of a movie star that Michael saw. It was the eyes of a man who had lived through pain, loss, and rebirth. "You still don't get it, do you?" Johnny's voice was quiet but cutting. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He looked down at the dollar in his hand, then back up at Johnny, his mind swirling with confusion. "You asked me for a dollar, Michael. But what if I told you that this dollar, this very moment, is the beginning of something much bigger than you can imagine?" Johnny's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Michael felt a flicker of something beyond his survival instincts, hope. But the flicker was quickly overshadowed by a nagging feeling in his gut. Johnny continued, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable weight. "What if I told you that this dollar is not just a piece of paper, but the key to something you've been searching for your entire life. Michael blinked, trying to make sense of the words. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss. The fear of the unknown gripped him, but something inside urged him to listen. You see, Michael, life isn't just about surviving. It's about choosing to live, to make decisions that can change everything. But you have to take the first step. Johnny paused, his gaze unwavering. And this dollar? This dollar is your first step. Michael's mind was racing now, his heart pounding in his chest. He had asked for $1, a simple request. But now, Johnny had turned it into something much larger, something he couldn't fully comprehend. What did it mean? What was Johnny trying to tell him? Before Michael could respond, Johnny did something that left everyone in the crowd speechless. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He handed it to Michael without a word. "Open it," Johnny said softly. Michael took the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on him. He hesitated for a moment, then tore open the envelope. Inside, he found a plane ticket, the destination, a small town in the Midwest. The ticket was for that very night. Johnny spoke again, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "This is your chance, Michael. A fresh start, a new beginning." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Johnny, then at the ticket, and back at Johnny. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Johnny smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Because you asked for $1, and that's the first step. Now you have to take it." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Michael stood there, holding the ticket in his hand, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The moment felt surreal. Everything he had known, everything he had been, could change in an instant. But would he take that first step? The envelope, the ticket, the choice. It all felt like a dream. Michael's hands shook as he gripped the plane ticket, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. The crowd around him remained silent, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for a decision that seemed too monumental to make in such a fleeting moment. Johnny stood still, watching, his gaze unwavering. He didn't push. He didn't rush. He simply let Michael take in the weight of the moment. Michael swallowed hard. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to walk back into the familiar world of survival, of scraping by day after day. The comfort of the known, even if it was painful, felt safer than the uncertainty of a new life. But then something shifted inside him, something that had been buried for years, hidden beneath layers of regret and self-doubt, began to stir. He looked at Johnny, his eyes searching for some kind of reassurance, some hint that this wasn't just another trick, another false hope. Johnny's voice broke through the silence. "You don't have to decide right now, Michael. But you have to understand this. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't give you time to figure things out. It just moves, and if you don't move with it, you'll be left behind." Michael's chest tightened. He had heard these words before, from people who didn't understand his struggle, from people who had never known what it was like to live on the streets, to fight for every meal, every breath. But there was something different about Johnny's voice. It wasn't judgment. It was an invitation to change. Johnny took a step closer, his voice softer now. "The world doesn't owe you anything, Michael, but you owe it to yourself to try. You owe it to yourself to take that first step, even if it's terrifying." Michael's breath came in short bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the ticket again. It was more than just a plane ride. It was a chance to break free from the cycle of poverty, from the feeling of being invisible. A chance to start over, to rebuild a life he had long thought was beyond his reach. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle over him. The fear was still there, but so was something else, hope, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Johnny placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch light but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Michael. The world is full of people who want to help, who want to see you succeed. But you have to believe in yourself first." Michael nodded slowly, his mind finally clearing. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had spent so many years running from change, from the unknown, that he had forgotten what it felt like to embrace it. He looked up at Johnny, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'll take the first step. Johnny smiled, his eyes warm with approval. That's all it takes, Michael. One step, and then the next, and then the next. The crowd, who had been watching in silence, erupted into quiet applause. It wasn't a loud, boisterous cheer. It was a soft, respectful acknowledgement of the moment they had just witnessed. Michael had made a choice, and that choice had the power to change everything. Johnny turned to leave, but not before offering one last piece of advice. The world won't change overnight, but if you keep taking steps, it will change for you. And one day, you'll look back and realize that this moment right here, was the one that made all the difference. As Johnny walked away, Michael stood there, the ticket still in his hand. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, each one carrying its own story, its own struggles. And for the first time in years, Michael felt like he wasn't alone. He felt like he had a future, a chance to rewrite his story. With a deep breath, he turned and walked toward the nearest bus station. The ticket was his first step. The rest he would figure out as he went. As Michael walked away from the corner where Johnny Depp had stood, the weight of the moment slowly began to settle in. The crowd had dispersed, but their murmurs followed him like a distant echo. Some were still whispering about what had just transpired, about the homeless man who had been given a chance, a plane ticket, a life-altering decision. The whispers were full of curiosity, but also something else, admiration. Michael's feet felt heavy as he walked down the street, the ticket clutched tightly in his hand. His heart still raced, but it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was something else, anticipation. The world had just opened up to him in a way he had never expected. But as he walked, he couldn't help but think of all the people he had left behind in that moment. The people who were still stuck in the same cycle of hopelessness. The people who couldn't see the way out. He wanted to go back. He wanted to tell them that there was more to life than surviving. That change was possible. That even someone like him, someone who had lived on the streets for so long, could take that first step and change everything. But Michael knew that the only way he could truly help them was by showing them. He had to live the change he wanted to see in the world. As he boarded the bus, he noticed the driver giving him a curious look. It wasn't judgment, just curiosity. Michael had become used to the stares, the looks of pity, and sometimes even disdain. But now, as he sat down and looked at the ticket in his hand, he realized something. The world saw him differently now. He wasn't just the homeless man who asked for $1. He was someone who had been given a chance, and he was going to make the most of it. The bus rumbled to life, and Michael leaned back in his seat, staring out the window. The city passed by, but for the first time he saw it with new eyes. It wasn't just a place full of people going about their daily routines. It was a world full of opportunities, full of chances waiting to be taken. And Michael was ready to take them. The bus ride felt like it lasted an eternity, but eventually it pulled into the station. Michael stepped off, the weight of the ticket still in his hand, but now it felt lighter. He wasn't carrying the burden of his past anymore. He was carrying the promise of his future. As he made his way to the airport, he couldn't help but notice the looks from the people around him. Some were curious, some were indifferent, but there was one thing that had changed. No one was judging him. No one was looking down on him. It was as if the world had recognized that he was no longer just a man with nothing. He was a man with a chance. At the airport, the security guard gave him a nod of acknowledgement as he passed through. The check-in process was smooth, and soon, he was sitting at the gate, waiting for his flight. As he sat there, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The fear that had once consumed him was gone. He had made his decision, and now he was going to see where it would take him. The flight was uneventful, but as the plane descended into the small town in the Midwest, Michael felt a wave of excitement. This was it. This was his new beginning. When he stepped off the plane, the air felt different, fresher, cleaner. The small town was quiet, but there was something comforting about it, something that felt like home. Michael didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. As he walked through the terminal, he saw a sign that caught his eye. It was a job fair with a booth for a local shelter that helped people get back on their feet. Without thinking, he walked over and introduced himself. The woman at the booth smiled warmly at him. "We're always looking for people who are willing to work hard and change their lives," she said. "What brings you here?" Michael smiled, a real smile, the first one in a long time. "I'm here to start over." The woman at the booth looked at Michael for a long moment, her eyes scanning him, but not in the way people used to. There was no judgment, no pity, just recognition. She could see the change in him, the quiet strength that now radiated from his every step. "Well then, you've come to the right place," she said with a welcoming smile. "We'll help you get started." Michael nodded, a sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. The past few days had felt like a whirlwind, but now, standing here in front of this woman, he realized how far he had come. He wasn't the same man who had asked Johnny Depp for $1 on the streets. He was someone different, someone who had chosen to take a chance to embrace the unknown. And it was in this small, quiet town, with a fresh start ahead of him, that he truly began to believe that anything was possible. As he filled out the application form, his mind wandered back to that moment on the street when Johnny had handed him the plane ticket. The kindness, the belief in him, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Michael had taken the first step, but it had been Johnny's words that had sparked the fire inside him. Johnny had told him that the world wouldn't wait, that it was up to Michael to take action. And he had. Now, as he looked at the job application, he realized that the transformation had already begun. It wasn't just about the job or the new life he was building. It was about the person he was becoming. The fear that had once paralyzed him was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. He was no longer defined by his past. He was creating his future. As he finished the form and handed it back to the woman, she smiled again, this time with a sense of pride in her eyes. "You're on the right path, Michael. Keep moving forward." With those words, Michael walked out of the booth, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The town, the people, the opportunities, it was all so new, so different. But it was real. And for the first time in his life, Michael felt like he belonged. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but smile. He had come so far, and yet he knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced the hardest part, making the decision to change. And now, the rest of his life was waiting for him. Michael paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the town. It was a beautiful sight, one he had never fully appreciated before. But now, it felt like a symbol of everything that had changed, of everything that was possible. In that moment, Michael realized that the transformation wasn't just about escaping his past. It was about embracing his future. And with each step he took, he was building a life that he could be proud of. The world had opened up to him, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt truly alive. Michael stood still on the sidewalk, his mind racing. The last few days had felt like a blur, like everything was moving so quickly that he could hardly keep up. He had left behind the life he once knew, a life of uncertainty, and now he was stepping into the unknown. There was no going back. He looked down at the crumpled plane ticket in his pocket, the one Johnny Depp had given him. The gesture, so simple yet profound, had sparked something inside him. He had never believed in second chances, but Johnny had given him one. Now it was up to Michael to make it count. The town he had arrived in was small, quiet, and unfamiliar. The streets were lined with modest houses, each one holding its own story, its own history. Michael could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had no job, no place to stay, and no plan. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He walked aimlessly down the street, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed to figure out his next move. As he passed a small coffee shop, the smell of freshly brewed coffee reached his nose, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of comfort. It had been so long since he had enjoyed something as simple as a cup of coffee. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the shop enveloped him, and the sound of soft conversation and clinking cups made him feel like he was part of something. The barista behind the counter greeted him with a smile, and for the first time in a while, Michael didn't feel invisible. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice kind. "Just a coffee, please," Michael replied, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. He didn't need anything fancy, just something to ground him, to remind him that he was still here, still fighting. As he waited for his drink, He couldn't help but notice the other customers in the shop. They were all so normal. They were talking, laughing, enjoying the simple moments of life. It was a stark contrast to the life he had known, the life of constant survival. But now he realized he was learning to appreciate these small moments. The barista handed him his coffee, and Michael took a sip. The warmth spread through him, and he closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the taste. It was more than just coffee. It was a symbol of the new life he was beginning to build. He sat down at a table by the window, looking out at the world outside. It was a peaceful scene, the sun shining down on the quiet street. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Michael had been working at the diner for months now, and while the routine had become familiar, there was still an underlying sense of uncertainty. He had made progress, but the fear of slipping back into his old life never truly left him. Every time he passed the alley where he had spent his nights, he felt the weight of his past bearing down on him, reminding him of how far he had come and how easy it would be to fall back into that world. One night, after closing time, Michael walked home through the quiet streets. The air was crisp, and the world around him seemed peaceful. But as he turned the corner, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, leaning against a street lamp, was Jake. His face was gaunt, his clothes tattered, and his eyes were hollow with exhaustion. The man who had once been his companion in the struggle for survival now looked like a ghost of the person he had been. Michael's heart sank. He hadn't seen Jake in weeks, and the sight of him now brought back a flood of memories, of the life he had left behind, of the nights spent on the streets, of the hopelessness that had once consumed him. "Jake, what happened?" Michael asked, his voice filled with concern. Jake looked up, his eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and shame. "I thought you'd forgotten about me," Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. "You think you're better than me now, huh? You think you could just leave everything behind and live a normal life?" Michael took a step closer, his heart aching for his old friend. He had been where Jake was, and he knew how easy it was to fall back into the cycle of despair. "No, Jake, I haven't forgotten about you," Michael said softly. I couldn't keep living the way we were. I had to change, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you." Jake scoffed, pushing himself off the street lamp and taking a step back. "You think you're the only one who's been through hard times? You think you're the only one who's had to fight for a better life?" Jake's voice cracked with emotion. "I've been trying, man. I've been trying to get clean, to find work, but it's not easy. And now, I'm back here, stuck in the same place." Michael could see the pain in Jake's eyes, the frustration of someone who had been stuck in the same cycle for too long. He knew the struggle all too well, but he also knew that change wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that could happen overnight. "I get it, Jake. I really do," Michael said, his voice steady. "But you have to make the choice. You have to decide if you want to keep living like this or if you want to try something different. I made that choice for myself, and I believe you can too. But it's up to you." There was a long silence between them, and Michael could see the internal battle playing out in Jake's eyes. Finally, Jake let out a long sigh and looked away. "I don't know if I can, Mike," Jake said quietly. "I don't know if I have it in me anymore." Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. He knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. But maybe, just maybe, his actions could show Jake that there was another way. "You don't have to do it alone, Jake," Michael said. "I'm here for you. But you have to take that first step. You have to believe that you're worth more than this life. Because you are." Jake looked up at Michael, his expression softening for the first time. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but instead he simply nodded. Maybe I'll try, Mike. Maybe I'll try." Michael smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't know what the future held for Jake, but he knew that he had done what he could. The rest was up to him. As Michael walked away, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made it out of the darkness. He had found a new path, a new purpose. And in that moment, he realized that the journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about finding hope, even in the most hopeless of places. He had started with nothing, but now he had everything he needed: a second chance, a future, and the knowledge that, no matter what, he could always choose a better path.